Welcome, history students. It's Miss Peterson, and we are going to be diving into day 5 of our Civil War mini unit. Now, we don't have Class Connect this afternoon due to the half day, due to the early out. Yay! So I'm in a meeting right now, during our normal CC time, so I created this video instead. So let's take a look at day 5. Our introduction quote here is, "The issue of slavery finally came before the Supreme Court. Dred Scott, a slave, thought he should be free because he had lived with his owner in a free territory for several years. What was the court's decision in this landmark case?" Hopefully you've already had a chance to complete today's reading to give you an idea as to what the Supreme Court decided. Just a really quick overview of our week. Monday we didn't have anything assigned due to the open house. Tuesday we had day 2, compromises, so we had that Class Connect. Wednesday was day 3, heating up in a Class Connect. Thursday was day 4, Lincoln and a Class Connect. So do make sure that you viewed or attended one of those Class Connects in order to complete the exit ticket requirement. I'm not going to include the exit ticket link in today's recording, but I do hope you watch this entire thing thoroughly because afterward you have your first Civil War unit quiz due. So make sure to take care of that by the end of the day as well. Okay, so the to-do items for today: read Chapter 45, A Dreadful Decision, Dred Scott, Chapter 47, Over the River and Underground, and Chapter 49, Harriet and Uncle Tom. You also want to view all of the online lesson content and then again take care of that quiz, which I will open up earlier than 11. So I'm just going to actually eliminate that. Make sure you do take care of that quiz today on Friday, September 13th. All right, so what do you think of when you hear the Civil War? You might think of things like 1860s, North versus South. It was fought over slavery. We think of Abraham Lincoln, right? Certain names, especially Abraham Lincoln's, come to mind. We think of the Emancipation Proclamation, which was the executive order to free slaves living in the southern United States. So if we look at this graph here, we can see that between 1800 and 1860, the U.S. was growing, right? So we see slave population here in red growing a little bit, but free population growing a lot, right? Going from about 5 million to, 27, 28 million. So a lot of growth in the United States between 1800 and 1860. And a lot of those people were moving west to, create new territories and states. And so this was a big issue. Will these be free states? Will they be slave states? This caused a lot of conflict, which you can see depicted here in this political cartoon. Here's another one, Kansas, Missouri. We learn about a lot of the different compromises and conflicts that occurred when deciding whether or not these new states should be free or slave states. A lot of different opinions there and back and forth. So today our focus is going to be about what did the court say about slavery and what do the people think about slavery during this time period. So we're going to be talking about the Dred Scott case, which went all the way to the Supreme Court. So what's the significance of the Dred Scott Supreme Court case? Next, we'll talk about Harriet Beecher Stowe, an author, and her book was titled Uncle Tom's Cabin. How did this sole book help to change public opinion about slavery? And then we'll talk about what was the Underground Railroad. I know many of you have already brought up the Underground Railroad in some of our other class connects. So today, first, what did the courts say about slavery? That's our first topic here. So let's take a look at the Dred Scott decision. Here is Dred Scott over on the right. Dred Scott was a slave, but he had lived in the free state of Illinois. And then in the free territory of Wisconsin, which is present-day Minnesota, the part that he lived in is now present-day Minnesota. So he was living in these free areas for several years before moving back to the slave state of Missouri. So he sued for his freedom, and he had a pretty strong case for gaining freedom. He sues. It kind of goes back and forth. Some courts were in his favor, others not, but eventually the case was taken all the way to the Supreme Court. Court, the highest court in the land, and the Supreme Court came down hard. This was 1857, and the Supreme Court they declared that all blacks, slaves as well as free, were not and could not become citizens of the United States. So basically, he didn't have a right to sue because he was not a citizen. And they declared, the court also declared that the 1820 Missouri Compromise was unconstitutional, which allowed slavery in the country's territories. So in U.S. territories, slavery was allowed. So going back to those political cartoons, a lot of conflict as to whether or not slavery should be allowed as the country expanded and moved west. All right, so Chief Justice of the Supreme Court was Roger Taney, and he said that because Scott was black, he was not a citizen and therefore had no right to sue. Didn't have the right to take his case to court. On the Declaration of Independence and the phrase, all men are created equal, it is too clear for dispute that the enslaved African race were not intended to be included and form no part of the people who framed and adopted this declaration. Again, this was part of Chief Justice Roger Taney's statement here. And he went on to say, the framers of the Constitution, he wrote, believed that blacks had no rights which the white man was bound to respect, and that the Negro might justify and lawfully be reduced to slavery for his benefit. He was bought and sold and treated as an ordinary article of merchandise and traffic whenever profit could be made by it. So he's basically saying that Dred Scott could not sue because he was property. Right? He, it was just a blow, right? The Supreme Court came down hard. Chief Justice Roger Taney came down hard, saying that Dred Scott did not have right to sue for his freedom. So the significance of the Dred Scott Supreme Court case, basically that slaves were property, right? That blacks had no rights and could not be citizens, even if they were free, even if they weren't slaves, even if they were free blacks. They had no rights and could not be citizens. And that basically blew up all these previous compromises, right? Saying it basically meant that slaves could be brought anywhere. It didn't matter if it was a free state, slaves could be brought anywhere. And again, remained property. So this was a pretty devastating blow, not only to Dred Scott, obviously, but to abolitionists, those people that were trying to put an end to slavery. So what do people think about slavery? Our next question to focus on today. Well, this brings us to the famous book Uncle Tom's Cabin, which was written by Harriet Beecher Stowe here on the right. Here's the book on the left, Uncle Tom's Cabin. Who cares about a book? What are we talking about a book? It was a very significant book. It was a total game changer. And we might say today in 2019, it went viral. People were talking about it. Everyone was talking about Uncle Tom's Cabin. It was perhaps the most important book of the entire 19th century, of the 1800s, and it sold 300,000 copies in the first 3 months. It was a book that depicted a pretty cruel slave owner. It depicted kind of this black slave. Tom is a kind of a heroic figure as a victim of this cruelty of the slave owner, and it really influenced how a lot of Americans viewed slavery, and a lot of Northerners were shocked after reading the book. A lot of Southern people were very angry after reading the book, so there were some differences in response to Uncle Tom's Cabin, written by Harriet Beecher Stowe. Abraham Lincoln met Harriet Beecher Stowe and was quoted as to say, "So this is the little lady who wrote the book that made this great war." That's how powerful Uncle Tom's Cabin was. It helped to create this huge divide between those that supported slavery and those that were against it, those abolitionists primarily in the North. So a big impact as a result of this book. So how did Harriet Beecher Stowe's 1852 book, Uncle Tom's Cabin, change public opinion about slavery? Well, it depicted blacks as real people, as real human beings. And that, it seems kind of silly. Well, duh. But this shocked a lot of Northerners and angered a lot of Southerners. So again, make sure that we know that there were two different results, or two different responses rather, to the book and its success. Okay, next we're talking about the Underground Railroad. And if we were in Class Connect, I would ask you guys to share what you know about the Underground Railroad. And I think oftentimes what I would see would be one name in particular, which we'll get to that name in a moment. But here is a map showing the Underground Railroad and some of the routes. You can see in these red arrows that these are some of the major avenues of escape. And different routes that they took. You can also see the blue are the free states, and I guess this is a purplish color, kind of almost a beige color. These are the slave states, and then the orange or tan would be territories. So you can see again routes from these slave states into free states, and then eventually sometimes Canada, or Mexico, or the Bahamas. So the Underground Railroad was a secret network organized by people who helped men, women, and children escape from Southern slavery to Northern freedom. So basically these routes of escape to freedom, again, whether it be Canada, Mexico, Bahamas. And again, here is another map showing these routes, again, corridors of escape in white to northern states or territories, British Canada, Mexico, Cuba, and the Bahamas. So different routes out of the slave territories, or slave states rather. Another map depicting routes of the Underground Railroad, and you could spend a lot of time looking at these different routes. But again, if I had asked you about the Underground Railroad, I would have a high confidence that this name would have been written on the board, and that is Harriet Tubman here on the right. Harriet Tubman escaped slavery herself, and she became a conductor on the Underground Railroad, meaning that she basically led some of these escape routes, that we looked at on the previous few slides, and she made 19 trips to the south and back, leading hundreds of people to freedom. So you think about how dangerous these trips were, the Underground Railroad trips. She made 19 of them. So we associate her with the Underground Railroad for very good reason. So what was the Underground Railroad? It was a secret network organized by people who helped men, women, and children escape from Southern slavery to Northern freedom. And we know Harriet Tubman as the famous conductor, leading hundreds of people to freedom through these Underground Railroad routes. Very heroic member in history. And to recap our questions of the day, what's the significance of the Dred Scott Supreme Court case? Well, the court case decided that Dred Scott was not free because he was considered property, that slaves were considered property, and that blacks had no rights and could not be citizens even if they were free. And it made previous compromises obsolete, and slaves could be brought anywhere, basically as a result of this Supreme Court ruling. So how did Harriet Beecher Stowe's 1852 book, Uncle Tom's Cabin, change public opinion about slavery? It depicted blacks as real people, right? And just the different struggles within slavery, and people were shocked. Northerners specifically were shocked. Many in the South were angered by this book. So it created quite a divide between North and South. Uncle Tom's Cabin. What was the Underground Railroad? It wasn't a literal railroad. More, it was these secret routes that were very well organized, and very specifically organized and strategically organized by people to help men, women, and children escape from slavery. So escape from Southern slave states to Northern freedom. And it says Northern freedom, but sometimes it was elsewhere, whether it be Mexico, Cuba, Bahamas, just to safety. And we know Harriet Tubman was the famous conductor, leading hundreds to freedom. 19 routes to the slave South and out again. All right, that's it for today. I know that I went pretty fast through that information. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to contact me. Again, exit ticket for the week. Make sure you either attended one of the sessions Tuesday, Wednesday, or Thursday to get the exit ticket link. Otherwise, you'll want to watch one of the recordings from those days. So have a great rest of your Friday. Have a great weekend, and we'll continue on with the Civil War next week. Bye, all.